Hey guys, welcome back to Team APS Plus, another one of your definitely daily uploads this month that I promised and did not deliver on. Things have been very busy. But today I'm talking about how your budget in Yu-Gi-Oh! Affects your strategy. And you might be hearing that and thinking, okay, well, duh, Paul. Like, obviously, if you can't afford a good card, then you just can't use it, and that just sucks. So, of course, it changes your strategy. But I do think it goes a little bit deeper than you might think, and that's kind of what I wanted to discuss today. And hear you guys' thoughts on your experiences with, using these budget cards or playing against opponents who have to do so, because it's something else that we'll be getting into a little bit here. So, starting from the top, Yu-Gi-Oh cards can be pretty expensive, right? You have to obviously buy packs or buy singles or however you get your cards, but there is a secondary market and cards cost money. There are cards that are really cheap and easy to get. There are cards that are really expensive, all because they're either very good or very elusive or a combination of both. And reprints and stuff can change that, but oftentimes the best cards are not reprinted yet, and that's kind of the stuff that's at the top of the tournament scene and the stuff that you need. So things can get really complicated and squirrely. So what do you do when you can't afford an expensive Yu-Gi-Oh card that you need, oftentimes a staple? Well, you have to go looking for budget alternatives. And there are plenty of videos on YouTube that will, give you exactly that. What is a budget alternative to X card? You can run this thing instead. Can't afford, say, Lightning Storm? Well, you could always just use Raigeki. Or can't afford, this thing, I don't know, Access Code Talker? Maybe you could use Boral Sword Dragon, right? So, it's usually a pretty simple one-to-one exchange, and depending on what sort of level of play you're at, like, locals, regionals, whatever, it might not be a big deal, but I do think that it can be. So, a really good example that I like to think about is Infinite Impermanence, a card that actually released, a few years ago now, back in like 2018, I want to say. This is a secret rare card. It was a very new and big staple in the game, and it went for as high as like $100. Now, the card that it was commonly replacing in many decks was something like, let's say, Effect Veiler. So Infinite Impermanence offered a pretty distinct advantage over Effect Veiler in that Effect Veiler can only be used in your opponent's main phase, whereas Infinite Impermanence can be used at any point in your opponent's turn, but also can even be used in your turn. It's a trap, but it can be used from the hand as long as you don't have cards in the field. You guys already know this. I'm just, dotting my T's and crossing my I's. So yeah, Infinite Impermanence offered some advantages over Effect Veiler. But if you couldn't afford Infinite Impermanence, it was usually fine to just run Effect Veiler in its place, right? Or you could even run something like Forbidden Chalice, because it did do a similar thing where, you can use it in your own turn to negate something. But no matter which replacement you were using, you didn't quite get all the benefits of using Infinite Impermanence. And that could actually come into play depending on like certain matchups, right? So if we're just talking stopping, say, a search effect, like a Stratos type monster that just searches a card from deck to hand, then Effect Veiler and Infinite Impermanence both kind of fill the same role for the most part. The monster gets summoned, it activates its effect to search or summon from deck or whatever. You Imperm it or you Veiler it, and it's pretty much, same story, right? This is all assuming that like your opponent's going first, you're going second. The usual scenario. On the other hand, though, let's take a deck like Thunder Dragons, which came out, a little bit later on, but yeah, so Thunder Dragon Colossus. The card is currently banned, but this is one of Thunder Dragon's boss monsters that does not allow you to add cards from your deck to your hand. So staring down at Thunder Dragon Colossus is extremely, extremely scary. And Effect Veiler can't really do anything about it because Thunder Dragon Colossus is sitting there, and even if you have Effect Veiler, you just can't use it. You can only use it in your opponent's main phase, and that's not really of any use to you when you're facing Colossus. What you can do is just start your turn off and use your Infinite Impermanence. Even if you drew it as your 6th card, it's extremely versatile in that way because it just allows you to turn off Colossus, and now you can start searching and having a good old time. So, if you couldn't afford Impermanence and you had to use Veiler, now your Thunder Dragon matchup actually looks drastically different. So what might have seemed like a simple one-to-one change, right? Like I looked up some YouTube video and it just said, I don't need Impermanence, I can just use Veiler, same thing. Well, it's not the same thing. Your matchup now looks a lot different, and so you have to approach that differently. Now, do you want to maybe go for something like Forbidden Chalice, which... Sorry, I'm coming off a cold. Do you want to go for something like Forbidden Chalice, where it can do, in this situation, it can do what Infinite Impermanence can do, where like, you can draw it or whatever when you're going second, and you can still hit Colossus, and now you can search, and things are all great and fine and dandy, but then you don't get what Effect Veiler got. or the, I guess, flexibility that Imperm got where it can be used in your opponent's. So you see where I'm going with this? You never quite get the best of both worlds, and that's really, really tough to deal with. Now, another really good example, I think, is Access Code Talker, which nowadays is a little bit easier to get, but for a while, it was also one of those cards that was like $100+ and it was kind of the big, board breaker OTK thing on the block. It sort of replaced Borrelsword Dragon in that regard. Now, here's the thing. If you couldn't afford Access Code Talker, you probably could afford a Borrelsword Dragon, but Borrelsword Dragon didn't have the advantage of not being able to have its effects changed to, or the advantage of being able to actually pop cards in the opponent's board. Yes, it could certainly deal a lot of damage, and in some cases that's all you might need to get a win, even through an established board, but you don't get that Access Code Talker kind of privilege, that extra perk. And that might actually change certain matchups where Access Code Talker might have been really useful and Borrelsword Dragon was not. Like, for instance, Access Code Talker can be fairly reliably summoned into monsters that have negations, or, spell and trap removal, or spell and traps in the back row and stuff that might try to negate him and chain him. He can still usually summon into that stuff, and if they don't actually negate the summon itself, then he's usually free to just start activating his effects and getting rid of stuff. Borrelsword Dragon does not get any such thing. So while they both might cover the role of OTKing, there's just a lot of benefits to having the more expensive one. All right, now to this point, you're probably following along and thinking, yep, I've been there, it sucks, whatever, staples are expensive and they're really hard to use. But it gets a little bit deeper because I think this can actually affect your opponent as well, and how you play against them. And we can even sort of extrapolate a little bit further to larger tournament environments, right? So there's a reason why I think locals are oftentimes just easier than regionals and YCS events. There's the obvious things, like there's more people at a regional or YCS. And of course, more people having traveled from more places and taking it more seriously, they're going to probably just be a better pool of players. But also with locals, you can be reasonably sure of who does and doesn't even have certain cards. There's just a person at your locals, a kid, for instance, who maybe just does not have 3 copies of Pot of Prosperity, right? It's like 40 or so bucks right now, I believe, and this kid just maybe doesn't have it. So that means that his deck that might be, well served by having Pot of Prosperity does not have Pot of Prosperity, which means that there is an inherent less consistency in his deck over time, overall, that you have to worry about. The same goes for whether or not he might have a copy of, let's say, Forbidden Droplets, right? Which again is a little more accessible now than it's ever been. But let's take when it was $100, right? If you can go into a match and not have to worry about your opponent even having Forbidden Droplet, you can actually make certain plays more safely or more reliably because you know that that counterplay just simply does not exist in your opponent's deck. And I think that that can really change the strategy that you take into locals versus a regional or YCS event. That to me is a big difference maker. It's not just a matter of oh, can my low tier deck compete against the meta decks? It's kind of more will my low tier deck be having to face this much harsher, more relentless, kind of unforgiving array of powerful staple cards, Forbidden Droplets, Access Code Talkers in every extra deck, consistency that comes from Pot of Prosperity. Are you able to deal with that versus at the local level where those cards just are not as common to see? If you're playing against an opponent where you know that those cards are in their deck, then your decisions become a lot easier and a lot less risky. And so I say this all because I do think that it's not enough to just say, okay, well, here's the budget replacement for a card, throw it in your deck, you're happy, done deal. It's not that that's a bad thing, and obviously some people just can't afford the most expensive thing, and if you can't afford it, then you've got to do your best. But I do think that it can sort of change your strategy. Now, that's not to all be doom and gloom, right? I think that there is a value in playing and experimenting with budget cards, even if you're forced to do so. I think you get a different look and perspective at matchups that maybe other players aren't getting. The players in the example I gave at first about Infinite Impermanence who are used to just having Imperm solve all their problems might see certain monsters as harder to deal with than you might because you're using Forbidden Chalice. Forbidden Chalice does have some advantages over Imperm. It's a quick play spell. It can be used, much more easily in the mid game, for instance, or it can be used in the damage step. And so you'll have certain advantages that maybe Imperm just was never offering you, and it might cause you to look at a certain matchup perhaps more positively than a player who's running supposedly the best cards. Now, it's not often the case, but I do think it is something worth mentioning, and so, yeah. I think there's just a lot more depth and nuance to card prices and how they change, strategy, how they should change your preparation and your deck building You know, if you're going to locals, you can maybe assume that people want to be able to afford things. But if you're going to a YCS, you should always assume that people have the most expensive and most sort of optimal build of something, and that price isn't really a factor affecting that. So yeah. What do you guys think? How do you feel about this? Have you been, I guess, on the receiving end of not being able to afford things? And also, have you been on the, I guess, sort of like, whatever the opposite of the receiving end is, the good end of knowing that your opponent does not have a certain expensive card, and so as a direct result, you are able to make plays and, you know, decisions because you know they want the proper counterplay to it. I'd like to hear about it down below in the comments. Anyways, that's going to be it. I'll see you guys in the next one, which will, I promise, be very soon. All right, pass turn.